one of the things that I tell my kids in my intro to epistemology class is, you know how things work. It's like you've been over to comment threads. People just like start like trolling each other almost immediately. What we do in philosophy is we stand for a way of thinking about reasoning and disputation that kind of allows you to not have to do that frustrating, horrible thing. It sort of like allows you to not let your passions lead you into acting like a jerk anytime somebody disagrees with you. But instead, you can sort of say, okay, cool, like let's step back, lay out in detail what the issues are, and see if we can collectively make headway.
All right, so welcome everyone to today's interview, where we are very pleased to welcome Professor Benj Hellie. He is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Toronto, and his research focuses primarily on mind, epistemology, semantics, and related issues, and he has a variety of papers on these topics. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Hellie.
Thanks for having me on. It's a delight.
Awesome. So there's a few things I wanted to talk about. One of your papers that I read in preparation discussed perception and perceptual noise. I found that to be pretty interesting. And you talk about how, in some way, perception represents colors and I suppose other things, but you focus on colors inexactly. And that's seemed pretty reasonable to me when reading it. Before I get into my kind of first question of a potential critique, do you mind just kind of briefly describing how this works and in contrast to maybe other views that maybe people take to be more standard or common?
Yeah, so I wrote this paper in response to a paper by the late Delia Graf Farah, who was one of my teachers in grad school. And she was working up her paper when I met her, and it came out in Mind in 1999. And so Delia was arguing that, these things that I call Nelson's predicament type cases, where somebody can't tell A from B and can't tell B from C, but can tell A from C. Those cannot be treated by a theory on which looks the same as intransitive, but instead they must be treated by a theory on which the way the thing, when you look at A the first time in comparison with B, and then the second time in comparison with C, the way that A looks has to change, or maybe for C. I think what Delia was working with was a conception of how a thing looks, kind of along the lines of old school sense data theory, where to say that the look of the color of this paint chip, that kind of lingo ascribes a certain specific determinate quality to something mental that's in you when you're looking at the paint chip. And if we think of, if we're thinking those terms that there are such features, then I mean, clearly, if it makes sense to speak of whether they're the same or different when instanced in the look of two things synchronically, or one thing diachronically. And there should be something like a kind of just equivalence relation of identity that allows us to speak of those things. And if you're think of the underlying phenomena by appeal to that kind of ideology, then Delia seems correct that looks the same. It better be transitive, because there's just a well-defined equivalence relation of same looking. That's just identity of sense datum quality, essentially. And so these Nelson's predicament type cases are going to have to be treated in some other way, and so most obviously in the way that she suggests, by saying that, well, the way the thing looks changes diachronically. And so I was thinking, though, along kind of different lines. So by this time, this kind of intentionalist way of thinking about the phenomenological had become a kind of big deal around Princeton, where I was in grad school. And so I was thinking, well, actually, this sense datum approach seems kind of funky and antiquated. And instead, there ought to be some kind of way of handling this in terms of the kind of representational content that your perceptual states have. And then once you start thinking in terms of representation, then you can start thinking in terms of whether the representation is exact or inexact. I guess I was also, I discovered Williamson's stuff through Delia at that time as well. And so, Williamson's first book, Identity and Discrimination, talks about this phenomenon of discrimination, discriminability, and indiscriminability, and offered kind of a sort of overlap of what the possibilities for the thing might be type way of thinking about inexact representation. And it occurred to me that you could use this type apparatus and then kind of back it up and explain it with this phenomenon of perceptual noise to kind of found this particular way of doing things in the phenomena. And if you said that, then hey, it looks the same, can't mean what Delia says. Instead, what does it mean? Well, maybe it means we can't tell the things apart. So they're indiscriminable, and indiscriminability, that's not transitive. Why? Because noise. So that's the account.
Yeah, very good. So a few things to note there. I mean, one, it just seems obvious that discriminability is going to be non-transitive to me. It's like, you can tell these things apart, or you can't tell these things apart. You can't tell these things apart, but the first and last you can tell apart. It's just that seems to be a given. And maybe we could argue that a theory of perception or intentionality, which is inconsistent with that, is thereby going to be false for some reason or another. I mean, is that sort of one way you go, or you're just trying to undermine the other views in some other way? Or
yeah, so I mean, I guess one thing about Delia's views at the time was that they had this asymmetry in them. She was explicit about that, and so as you may know, some of the audience may know, Delia worked kind of most centrally on vagueness, and their considerations of discrimination, discriminability were very central to the way she was doing things. So she was a kind of early adopter of the epistemicist approach. So she wanted to account for Sorites type phenomena in terms of the non-transitivity of indiscriminability. So she, I don't recall whether this is in print, but she did at least say at one point, maybe in a seminar, that she thought that the sort of phenomenal stuff is supposed to be a counterexample to this, the general transitivity of indiscriminability. And her argument for that, I was looking over my paper, had to do with a kind of principle relating what it is for two things to look the same, to which colors those things look to have. And this notion of looking to have a color, I think, was something that she was understanding in this way that's unfriendly to representationalism, and sort of went along the kind of more sense datum lines that I was describing earlier. And I think that was sort of what led her off course in that, drawing that conclusion.
Yeah, And on sense datum theory, that's not something you would endorse, or is it? Because in that paper, I thought you say somewhat in passing that that's something you um, would endorse here as an account here. You say that perceptual noise occurs because of variation in the perceived sense datum or something like that, or is that?
Yeah, I think like when I was when I was working this stuff up, I was kind of interested in H. Price and his like kind of weird kind of geek out kind of tinker toy constructivist way of thinking about sense data. That was something that I eventually kind of got out of. But I think the story in this paper is supposed to be, I think, neutral between a kind of intentional story and sense data on which, like a sense data theory on which the kind of facts about representational content is grounded, so to speak. And for the friend of the sense datum theory, I did end up citing kind of the spirit of what Delia was suggesting, but maybe not to the letter. So I was thinking that, hey, you know, because of this phenomenal noise, this kind of flickering, incessant crepitation in the visual field, it is the case that you know, we're never in a position that it's always changing, and we're never in a position to pin down diachronically whether a sample looks the same in that sense from one experience to another. But I also contended that this did not really, that there is nevertheless this other understanding of looks the same in terms of indiscriminability that Delia was mistaken for. So sort of, if you like sense data, then she's kind of right, but also kind of wrong. And if you don't like sense data, then she's not right. That's the line.
Right. Yeah. I think you say in that part of the paper that you're not relying on the falsehood of sense data theory, but maybe on certain versions of it, I guess. But also the conclusion's open. The argument is good for a representationalist too.
I was definitely trying to be neutral between those approaches. I guess like kind of around this time, I went through this thing where I was thinking like, hey, you know, maybe we want a theory that's got sense data and intentional content that's sort of read into the sense data.
Fair enough. And so I had this potential criticism. I don't know. See what you think about it. How to put this the right way. So what if someone said, okay, we do, colors are represented exactly. It's just that what color means there isn't like necessarily precise. So some like relatively coarse notion, which we might fine grain further into, you know, precise positions in the color solid or whatever. You know, but by analogy, when I experience a house, my experience or representation might represent the house exactly, even though its precise microstructure isn't represented, for example. But precise microstructure is like irrelevant to the notion or representation of a house. Does this make any sense, or what do you think?
It absolutely does. So the thought is that maybe kind of when we talk about the color the thing looks to have, we're talking about a kind of determinable. And yeah, and so this was like a, you know, you definitely hit on something that was a kind of nagging worry for me the whole time that I was working on this paper. And I really wanted to suggest that you know, something that I didn't really have the capacity to articulate at the time, but what turned out to be a kind of maybe Fregean view of perceptual content, sort of along the lines of the one that Dave Chalmers was working up at around this time. When I was writing this, I was not yet familiar with his stuff on that. I didn't learn about that until maybe a year later. but yeah. So I mean, I completely agree that if we have a kind of Russellian view on which there's representation of a determinable, that the kind of Nelson's type, Nelson's predicament type phenomena cannot be addressed in the way that I was suggesting. Rather, I was thinking that there is a determinate color, that like a maximally determinate color that we're, kind of perceptions trying to get at, and that color is sort of the Russellian content of the perception, but there's also a kind of mode of presentation of that color on which, it's sort of, it's in there, like it's in this range somewhere, but sort of it's not clear exactly where. And then that level is the kind of level that would be rationally relevant to determining whether we can make these discriminations or not. So yeah, I mean, I take the objection, and I think that that there is a way of understanding what I'm saying there on which it's distinct from the position that meets the objection.
Yeah, fair enough. So the point being there, part of the point I understand is that if it's supposed to be, if color perception is getting at a determinable, then your argument really isn't against that. But if it's like trying to get at a specific determinate color, something very precise.
Exactly. So yeah, if you perfectly get the determinable, then that paper, my paper is in trouble. But if you imperfectly get the determinate, then it goes
right.
through.
Then that seems fair enough. But then the question there is which way should we think about color perception or perception more generally?
Yeah, the suggestion is like in the paper at least, is that you should do the latter. And I think that so I offer these two arguments for inexactness, if I recall correctly. So I offer this kind of naturalistic argument and this kind of phenomenological argument. The naturalistic argument is like, hey, signal chains are imperfect and they're noisy. So therefore we can't expect exact representation. Okay, cool. So that's an argument that something's being done imperfectly, in which case the thing that's being done is represent the exact thing imperfectly. So there's that argument. Then there's the phenomenological argument, which is like, hey, I notice all this jumping around, and that's something that's kind of frustrating. It's, sort of there's this phenomenological noise. That's something that's frustrating. It sort of seems to stand in the way of what, of the color itself that I'm trying to get at. So that also seems, so there's this kind of phenomenological sense of an imperfection. So kind of, again, it's sort of that suggests doing it the Phrygian way.
Yeah, fair enough. And those are definitely worth exploring as well. But I wanted to move on to another one of your papers that I had a look at on higher order intentionality and acquaintance.
Yeah.
And that paper gets a bit complicated, but I found it mostly accessible and pretty interesting. And one thing I want to note though is that you draw a distinction between intentional and non-intentional relations of awareness. And that like plays a lot of work in the paper.
Yeah.
But on its face, though, someone might say that non-intentional awareness is like almost a contradiction in terms. Awareness is necessarily this intentional notion. How would you respond to that potential concern? I mean, how is it that it's not just absurdity on its face?
Cool. So I was thinking along kind of Williamson type terms, where there are two maybe levels of propositional attitude. So there are the factive and the non-factive propositional attitudes, and they're both mental. For Williamson, we've got knowledge and belief as the factive, and the non-factive correlates. this kind of factive, non-factive distinction, that's something that I ended up getting into slightly after this in this paper I called Factive Phenomenal Characters, which was kind of like Williamsonized Mike Martin or something. But here I've got this more kind of thinking in terms of like my relation to the object as opposed to a more kind of content way of thinking about the mental. And so the thought is like, well, okay, so sometimes what I'm doing is I'm aiming at the object and the mental aspect of things the same, but in other cases there's a kind of mental relation that's requires the presence of the object, and such that my condition in regard to it's not going to be the same, like unless the object's actually around. So that's a sort of non-intentional relation of awareness.
So is the difference there that in the non-intentional relation of awareness, some feature over and above some intention feature is required for the relation to obtain, or something like that?
So I was thinking that if we classify the mental relations, we might recognize a subcategorization where on the one side, we've got the ones that are genuine relations. They require the presence of the object. And then the other side, we've got the sort of pseudo relations, the ones that are merely intentional and that you can stand in the same position, like even when the object's not around. And so I was seeing this as kind of analogous to the contrast in the propositional attitudes that Williamson was, kind of working out at the time between the factive ones, like knowledge, and the non-factive ones like belief, where the factive ones require the truth of the proposition or maybe a fact to be the attitude, whereas the non-factive ones don't. They're compatible with falsity.
Right. Yeah, and I guess that makes sense. And when you talk about the non-factive intentional states like belief and so forth, do you accept that there's a sort of an intentional object there, or what's your view on even if it's not true, if it doesn't exist, or what is your view on that? Or because it seems just kind of strange to me when you talk about intentional in existence and so on.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. I think like maybe at the time I was sort of like when I was writing this, maybe I was a little bit friendly to that paper, but I kind of like played around with my Noggianism for a brief period, and like I was into Terence Parsons for a little while on these things, but I was kind of cured of that. These days I'm not even super excited about objects of mentation. I've become much more of a content guy. I mean, I definitely think that there are false, that sometimes we believe the false, and that for philosophical purposes, it's good to characterize belief as a relation to a proposition, such that some of the propositions are false. As far as the metaphysics of what's going on there, I don't think there is one. That's something else we can get into.
Yeah, that's interesting, and maybe we'll get into that, but more in that paper, you also seem to endorse a view of intentionality, which allows that intentionality is almost like ubiquitous. It's like a very common occurrence, right? And that things, like even non-mental things, can exhibit intentionality because of dispositions they have, or certain biological functions and so on. I mean, is this something you would what comment on this?
Boy, that's those are days long in the past. What do I think about that stuff now? I guess like, okay, so I have come to I've come to think that there's a bright line division between discourse about the mental and kind of, things in that ballpark and everything else, so that we would not want to say that there are features that hold of the mental and also of some other stuff. I mean, as far as kind of objective, non-mental characterization of the world, I guess, my line there is that dispositions are intentional. Like, what, do I think that there are dispositions and that they are intentional? I'm not sure. I mean, that's something that I don't really have strong philosophical commitments on.
Right. So you've come back off that a bit from what you seem to suggest in that paper, at least, or
as you can tell, I get enthusiastic about things.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, the paper was from, I guess it's 15 years ago now. So
yeah, boy, I was writing this,
changed.
like, I think I started writing this paper probably in about 2002 or something. So it's almost 20 years. Yeah, it took forever to get it published too. It was like, I think it was maybe accepted in 2004, then it was released 3 years later.
Yeah. And also in that paper, you talk, of course, you talk about like higher order intentionality. And I have to mention, because I've previously talked with Professor William Lycan, and he has presented arguments in favor of higher order theories of intentionality and consciousness. And well, maybe if I just, you're probably familiar with it, but I could present an argument that he gives, a quick argument that he gives, and maybe get your thoughts on that.
Sure.
Yeah, so this is from his 2001 paper and analysis. He says, a conscious state is a mental state whose subject is aware of being in it. It's like a definition. The of in one is the of intentionality. What one is aware of is an intentional object of the awareness. 3, intentionality is representation. A state has a thing as its intentional object only if it represents that thing. 4, awareness of a mental state is a representation of that state, on premises 2 and 3. And so finally, a conscious state is a state that is itself represented by another of the subject's mental states, 1 and 4.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, I could type that out if you want to.
No. I think I zeroed in on the point that struck me as at least slightly contentious. So, namely, the of is the of intentionality. So, hey, like when I see this, my seeing this cup is a way of being aware of it. But seeing is not intentional. Seeing is relational. Or to the extent that you think, okay, so that paper, I appeal to this kind of star dagger distinction that Gilbert Harman invokes in the intrinsic quality of experience, that infuriating little classic, and where there's like the star, there's see star, which requires the object. So seeing star is a non-intentional relation of awareness. There's also see dagger, which does not require the object. So we say Macbeth saw a dagger, but he didn't see star, a dagger, because he didn't see star or anything. Gil was maintaining. So, we might say, we might accept this distinction, but then in really asserting that the of that's involved in the characterization of a conscious state is the of intentionality. It's sort of like, well, why isn't it? Why is it the of? Why does it have to be the of dagger rather than the of star? So the view that I attempt to defend the latter, the view that it's a non-intentional, kind of purely relational position.
Right. Yeah, because I think in talking with him, he seemed to agree that if someone were to reject this argument, it's probably that second premise, the of there being the of intentionality, that they'd have to deny.
I'm glad to
or
hear
I
that
guess
Bill
they
and
could
I are.
attack representationalism, I suppose.
I'm glad to hear that Bill and I are on the same page about that.
Yeah. Although he still thinks it's correct, but you know, um, I guess if someone were to try to push back on that, it's like that the of is this non-intentional relation. Can you maybe this is going to return back to some of the stuff we've already sort of touched on, but how exactly does that relation work in the case of conscious mental states? Like what if it's not intentional? Like what sort of relation is it? I guess is maybe the question.
Well, what I labeled it was a relation of acquaintance, and so that's this terminology, that's a lot, probably a lot of people are familiar with from Bertrand Russell, and I guess Russell, it was something that was had been in the air in British philosophy for a long time. This kind of distinction between kind of relational, sort of direct awareness and kind of non-direct representational types of awareness. Russell, labels the former knowledge by acquaintance, the latter knowledge by description. And what kind of a relation is it? I guess it's like a relation that requires the presence of its object. And I think I was trying to I was flipping through this paper, trying to figure out what the argument was not too long ago. And I think the argument's supposed to be something like, we would only be able to explain the epistemic power of phenomenal character if our awareness of phenomenal character is non-intentional, because it has that epistemic power only by making it seem as if phenomenal character is the immovable basis of epistemic justification. And why would it even seem that, if our awareness of phenomenal character were intentional, it couldn't even seem that way. So there's this maybe argument from the argument by best explanation of how it is that phenomenal character could play its justificatory role. I'm making a face because I don't believe any of this stuff anymore.
Fair enough. Is to understand, is part of the idea there that if us being in if our awareness of a particular state was itself intentional, then epistemically that's like more open to doubt, I suppose, than if it were non-intentional, or what's the idea there?
Yeah, maybe it's boy, let me take a look here. Okay, so here we go. So about 2 pages before the end of the section 3, just at footnote marker 32, I say, it is prima facie plausible both that when things go right, this should be clear, and that when things go wrong, which one should be subject to further delusions, such as that things are going right. But why should it be in the nature of a state compatible both with things going right and with things going wrong that it strike one that things are going right? Yeah. So that's the argument there. And a little bit more expansively, the beginning of the paragraph runs, there's much to be said for explaining consciousness in terms of non-intentional relations of awareness, to wit, the opposing strategy remains a research program, blah, blah, blah. But more importantly, this principle IRA justif PC, which says that bearing an intentional relation to an F always accompanies and is accompanied by the phenomenal character of bearing its broadening, the phenomenal characteristic of bearing its broadening to an F. Okay, and so I claim that that's a little bit more difficult to justify as a basic postulate than the
non-intentional version.
doctrine that bearing a NIRA to an F is always accompanied by a certain characteristic phenomenal character. So I really think that what I'm trying to say there is that I'd argued that phenomenal character plays a fundamental role in epistemic justification, and it couldn't do that unless I had direct acquaintance with phenomenal character.
And direct acquaintance has to be non-intentional.
Non-intentional. Maybe that's
right. Yeah, is that, you kind of shaking your head, is that not something you would endorse as much anymore, or what do you think?
So, I mean, I came to think of the discourse of phenomenal character as fundamentally confused, and I stopped using it. I came to think kind of more deeply of the assimilation of, mental predication to the ascription of non-mental properties as a kind of semantic confusion, and such that we don't even want to say that there are mental properties. That whatever it is that I'm doing when I say Fred believes that goats eat cans, this predicate believes that goats eat cans is not in the business of qualifying Fred as being a certain way. So that's there's a kind of anti-realism or like expressivism that I eventually got into about all mental discourse, that sort of obviously makes questions about sort of metaphysical questions about what the denotation of mental discourse is like, puts those questions aside because mental discourse doesn't denote. So there are no questions about those denotations to be asked.
Right, that's interesting, and so I mean, on your current view, what would you say? Well, I guess, what are we doing, and how do we assess statements like, Fred believes that P or whatever? I mean, is that just not true theft, or what would you say?
Yeah. So I mean, I think if I see Fred trying to feed a can to his pet goat or something, then I would be perfectly correct to say Fred believes that goats eat cans. But what I think I'm doing there is not describing the world as being such that Fred has a certain property, but rather expressing a sentiment to the effect that when I simulate or empathize with Fred, I'm, I empathize my way into a mental state according to which things are like this: goats eat cans. So there's a kind of expressivist understanding of mental discourse, where I'm not describing reality at all, rather I'm expressing a sentiment. And how could it be that mental ascriptions, like Fred believes that so-and-so, Fred, Sam intends that so-and-so, like Rance wonders whether, blah, blah, blah. How could those, how could statements like that be expressions of my sentiment? Answer, they're expressions of my sentiment about how I simulate or empathize with those people.
Interesting. Is that also true for like things like qualia and other aspects of consciousness, or
Good, good. Yeah. So one of the things that, there was kind of a slightly twisty path from this kind of trying hard to use these Williamson type resources to figure out what's going on with consciousness to this kind of expressivist um, rejection of mental fact, mental mental properties and propositions altogether. Um, and certainly worries about what people meant when they talked about Qualia or phenomenal character was a big part of it. And one of the things, one of the kind of packages, one of the parts of the package of doctrine that I've come about over the years is that there are sensational qualities and there are sensory qualities and there are plenty of facts about people, about the presence of sensible qualities in things, the presence of sensory qualities in our bodies, and about sensory relations between organisms and sensory qualities, and so on and so forth. So these are all completely robust and in good standing metaphysically, and they describe the world. Those are facts about the world and stuff. But they also aren't facts about the mental. And instead, there are kind of closely associated facts about the mental, which are facts about our which of these facts about the qualitative we're aware of, in particular, which ones come to inhabit our evidence.
Right. So there's facts about which of those qualitative properties are related to us in certain ways, be it evidential or something else, but there's no facts of the sort like, I don't know, I'm having a what about like a pain experience or something like that? Is there a fact of that sort?
Pain has some modest complexities to it. So maybe a slightly easier way into it is to think about just like tickle or pressure. So the thought there is, well, by analogy, here's Olga. She's got this quality on her pink, right? And okay, so too, when I press my hand, the kind of sort of quantitative physical aspect of pressure being applied is part of what's going on, but there's also this kind of quality there, namely sensation of pressure. Now, the presence of sensation of pressure isn't yet the indication of anything mental at all. And for this, I got kind of convinced by these arguments that David Rosenthal uses to argue for the higher order approach, where he's like, hey, you got like itch in your heel or something, and you're chatting with your friend gets up from the cafe table, and you notice that there had been an itch in your heel all along that you weren't paying any attention to because you were so engrossed in the conversation. Right? So I'm like, yeah, that could happen. Cool. So when did that itch impinge itself on consciousness at all when your friend was still there? No. Does that mean that there was no itch there? No. Intuitively, the itch was there all along. Maybe it was even there before you got to the cafe. You just came to ignore it. So okay, cool. So itch is not mental, and the presence of itch doesn't have any direct mental consequences. It can be taken up mentally when we turn attention on it, and that has some pretty important downstream effects. But the taking up by turning attention, that's mental, but it's something that's, so to speak, super added to the presence of the edge itself. That's the one.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Let's see. I was going to add something. Yeah, it's kind of a maybe a bit of an unintuitive view. It's not something I'm so familiar with, but yeah, worth exploring, I guess. Maybe we'll come back to that, but I did want to talk about another one of your papers that I had a look at on mostly concerning the word must and the epistemic and normative uses of that.
Yeah.
Like there's a distinction between, it seems like Fred must have done A versus like Fred must do A, whereas the latter seems to be stating or committing to some sort of obligation, whereas the former is something more epistemic. I mean, do you think just broadly that the word must there is equivocal in those two uses, in the sense that maybe it's just some like a matter of linguistic accident that the same like token is being used in both expressions, and that what is being expressed is entirely different, or is there some like close connection between those two uses?
Interesting. Yeah, cool. So I guess against the kind of ambiguity approach would be like, well, if there was an ambiguity, we would expect to be able to get both readings for both constructions. So like the kind of contrast is when you don't, so it's like aspect, that's Fred, we contrast Fred opened the door to Fred had opened the door, Fred is opening the door, and Fred has been opening the door. So the first one of those, we'll say, doesn't have aspect on it, and the other three do. And so the effect that I got worried about in this paper, obligation and aspect, is I call it obligation aspect effect. And that's that if I say, if I apply must to an aspect free sentence, Fred must open the door, that's about an obligation, whereas, the other three, Fred must have opened the door, Fred must be opening the door, Fred must have been opening the door, those are really epistemic saying. So if there were two words that were both pronounced must and that kind of behave like modals, we would kind of say anticipate that you'd be able to access either of those in action on either of, either the aspect containing or the aspect free ones. But the striking thing about this effect is that really, you kind of really can't, you kind of really can't get a obligative reading of the ones with aspect. You kind of really can't get a epistemic reading of the ones without aspect. So we definitely want to explain that asymmetry, and I feel like the ambiguity view would be the wrong way to go about it. So I want to say, what I try and do in this paper is provide a kind of unified meaning of what, unified explanation of what must means that yields this contrast.
Yeah, very good. So what if someone were to try to say something like, no, it really is an ambiguity, and we can explain this the fact that you can't like substitute them by the fact that certain word must in one sense like only admits to certain like constructions around it or something. I'm not sure if I'm putting this the right way, but like you know what I'm saying? Like
Sure. Yeah. Gotcha. So the thought is sort of like we could say like must and moost or something, just to disambiguate, and like
sure.
So moost that only acts on the aspecty ones. Moost for I'll let you moost do this, right? So moost acts only on the no aspect ones, and must that acts only on the aspecty ones. I mean, I guess like one worry is that the other modals in English. So there's a kind of interestingly regular modal system in English. So English has 9 modal auxiliaries, which is a sort of a strange number. Usually when there's a kind of generative production of some stuff by getting, comparing things along various dimensions, they come in some binary system, right? But these 9 are must, could, can, may, might, should, shall, will, and would. So those are the 9 English modal auxiliaries. There is a 10th, it turns out, in older English, which is mote. And you can see this on the inner groove of Led Zeppelin 3. If you've got the LP, it's like, do what thou wilt, so mote it be. They're quoting Aleister Crowley's Satanist creed. So mote sort of is the present tense version of must, in the same way that can is the present tense of could, and may is the present tense of might, and so on and so forth. Right? So what we've got is a kind of stack of present and past inflected versions of 5 different clusters of modal auxiliary. And why should there be 5? Well, will and would stand outside the others, because will and would have this kind of, you can shoot negation freely in and out of them. So not will P is the same as will not P, and not would P is the same as would not P, maybe. Whereas the other 8 modals, you can't shoot negation freely in and out of them, because not can is not the same as cannot, right? It's not the case that you can that can phi, that means phi is impossible. But if can not phi, then that's just to say that non-phi is possible, right? Which is short of phi's being impossible. Yeah, so the other modals, you've got this different kind of interaction with negation. So that's sort of one big division. And then you've got must and mote behaving similarly to can and could in a certain respect, and should and shall, may and might behaving similarly in a different respect. Okay, so brief little overview of the English modal auxiliary system. And the behavior of these guys is like remarkably constant. I mean, they have very interestingly different semantic behaviors, but they all have exactly the same distribution. So you can always just take an inflected or uninflected, like an aspect possessing or aspect free tenseless clause and stick any modal auxiliary on it and get a sentence in English. And so the prevailing regularity would be something that would fit a little bit less well with an ambiguity way of thinking about it. It's more sort of like there's this kind of cognitive systematicity that we come to grasp as speakers of English, and we learn these words that go with particular positions in this 2x5 grid.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That's. I think that helps a bit. Just another note. In that paper, there's this line, although I'm not sure if it comes back significant. Oh yeah, it does come back. I think in section 4, where you talk about how modals quantify over mental states, not over worlds.
Yeah.
Is that something you would still endorse with your current views on mentality, or what would you?
Yes.
What's going on there?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Right. So kind of where I wound up is with this view that philosophy has made a mistake about what logic should be about. And, kind of we're taught in our undergrad logic classes that a valid inference is one that's truth preserving. But why say that? Why not instead say that a valid inference is one that if you endorse the premises, you got to endorse the conclusion. So it's kind of endorsement preserving, or endorsement's mental rather than, in contrast with truth, which is non-mental. There's at least this kind of prima facie argument for it. There does seem to be such a thing as imperative inference. So if I say, Fred, open the door and close the window, that sort of seems to entail Fred, open the door. And yet it makes no sense to speak of an imperative that's true or false. So whatever is going on with imperative entailment, it cannot be preservation of truth. So we could either say that there's imperative entailment and there's declarative entailment, where The latter is about preservation of truth. The former is about something else. Or we could find something unified to say that brings both of them under the same umbrella. And the problem with the former approach is that there are kind of cross type inferences. Like, so if I say, if it's raining, close the window, it's raining, those seem to entail close the window. So you've got like a declarative premise and an imperative conclusion with what looks like a kind of modus ponens type inference. And so that suggests that we can't parcel out imperative and declarative logic in this way. Instead, we've got to say that there's something that unifies declarative and imperative inference. And the only thing that I can see that might do that is endorsement, because we can endorse both a declarative and an imperative sentence.
Right. Sorry, did you want to say more on that?
Oh, yeah. And so you'd asked, do I think that modals quantify over mental states? Yeah. It's sort of, if you think that logic is about the preservation of truth, well, then what bestows truth values are possible worlds. And so it's kind of natural to think that what modals quantify over are the things that bestow the values that logic cares about. Okay, so if you think that logic cares about not truth values, but instead endorsement, the things that bestow those are mental states, then you should think by analog that what modals quantify over are mental states.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting argument. A couple of things I want to note. On that thing you said about how you gave that example of an apparent modus ponens argument where consequent of the conditional is an imperative. What if someone were to say that that's just not a well-formed statement or something like that? I mean, this maybe has some parallels in like for non-cognitivism and Frege stuff like that. I mean, but what do you think of that sort of response?
I mean, I guess who's being the philosopher here? Who the intuitive man, right? Like people, it's like, hey, we use this kind of conditional imperative style modus ponens in practical reasoning. So it's like, okay, I got this plan. I'm not going to close the door, close the window unconditionally. Like if it's not raining, I want to have it open. But if it is raining, I want to close it. So I've got this conditional intention to close the window on the condition that it's raining. So like, cool. What happens? I come to see that it's raining. I go close the window, right? And so one way to think about the kind of reasoning that's involved there is my conditional intention is captured in my endorsement of this conditional sentence. If it's raining, close the window. And then when I make this discovery, I come to endorse it's raining, and then I conclude by modus ponens the imperative, close the window, and then I do.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. But on this view that logic is tracking endorsement or certain mental things, how exactly does that work? Because it seems like in someone may endorse premises of a valid argument, but not endorse a conclusion. Maybe that's irrational, but it's possible, right? Or is that not a problem?
Good. So I want to suggest that if you endorse the premises of a valid argument, you do endorse the conclusion. Okay, so what's the challenge we face in saying that? Well, it's like, hey, sometimes people seem like they endorse the premises and don't endorse the conclusion. Okay, cool. So now here we've got these two pieces of evidence about the guy. He seems to endorse the premises. He seems to endorse the conclusion. So can I make sense of what's really going on with this guy? I mean, so somebody thinks either it's either the butler or the gardener did it. The butler didn't, but they don't accept either the butler or the gardener did it, and they endorse the gardener didn't do it, but they don't endorse the butler did it. So, if I ask, okay, this guy's pattern of behavior and asserting and failing to, refusing to assert certain sentences, what can I make of his picture of the world? If I'm trying to describe the world as he conceives it to be, is there a coherent way that I can do that? Well, no, because I know that he thinks that either the butler or the gardener did it. He thinks the gardener didn't. And if you picture the world as being both those ways, then you picture the world as being such that the butler did do it. Okay. And yet, at the same time, he also seems to picture the world as not being such that, to fail to picture the world as being such that the butler did it. So if he does that, then he can't picture the world as being both the other ways, right? So what to make of this? Well, his behavior puts me in a kind of like an irreconcilable quandary. So I get into this position of uncertainty about how he pictures the world that I can't get rid of by learning more. So there's a kind of deep, irresolute uncertainty. And yeah, to me, to use these kinds of considerations in prediction, I'm stuck.
Yeah. Yeah, but what about cases where the inference is more much more complicated, maybe? Like I have in mind cases where someone accepts, say, the axioms of some mathematical system, but doesn't accept the truth of some theorem, which in fact follows for them, but it's like a complex matter of derivation to show that it would. Is that it's still a valid argument that the premises they're accepting potentially, but they're not accepting conclusion? I mean, that doesn't seem so hard to imagine, though. Does that generate the same sort of sticky situation, or what would you say regarding that?
Absolutely, yeah, yes, I definitely think it does. So let's take piano arithmetic as the theory in question. It's like, okay, cool. So this guy endorses the axioms of piano arithmetic. Like, what exactly does that amount to? I don't know, but let's suppose that he's in whatever mental state that doing that gets you into. Okay, cool. Well, one thing that I know about that mental state is that somebody who is in it, it's sort of to imagine being in it, I imagine thinking that there are infinitely many twin primes. Is that true? There are infinitely many primes, at least. Yeah, okay. So I know that, having imagined this for myself, because I accept piano arithmetic, let's say, I know that one of the things that you have to accept, is that there are infinitely many primes. So there's this dude over there, he claims to accept the axioms of piano arithmetic. Cool. Okay, like I try and get into his mental state. And one of the things that I notice is that here's how the world is. There are infinitely many primes. But then he announces, I have no idea whether the number of primes is finite or infinite. I'm like, wait a second. Let's go out with this guy. There, it's sort of, again, I'm in a quandary, like which mental state is he in?
Yeah, right. But like, what about for some unproven conjecture? I mean, it's truth or falsity, we suppose, does follow from those same piano axioms. I don't know, like say Goldbach's conjecture. As far as I know, it's unproven, and as far as I know, his truth value is determined or does follow from those axioms. What would we say in that case?
I mean, I guess my thought is that I myself don't know the status of this principle, so I shouldn't kind of build reasoning about it into my interpretation of other people. Observe one of the things that just happened, right? So that was a kind of highly expressivist type move to make. So you were applying pressure. It's like, well, either it's true or it's false. So it's like there's either the guy's in a coherent mental state or he isn't. But I was thinking, well, there aren't, if we're expressivists about mental states, we don't have to say that in a certain respect this guy's reasoning is coherent or it isn't. Rather, the kind of level that we should be thinking about it at is like, can I make coherent sense of his behavior by certain aspects of his behavior by engaging in mental reasoning about the guy? And that's kind of that's our bedrock. It's not as if when I'm doing that, there's some underlying condition of the world that I'm attempting to accurately characterize. Rather, I'm merely engaging in a kind of disciplined game of manipulating my own mental state hypothetically with the end of understanding my data about this guy's behavior, sort of.
Yeah, I'll have to think about that a bit more, because it's a very different sort of approach than orthodoxy, I guess we might put it.
Pretty weird, yeah.
But you find it kind of comfortable in a way, or just like this is what you've been led to as?
Yeah, it's what I've been led to, right? So it's sort of like when I was writing these kind of earlier papers, I was noting all these kind of pressures and incoherencies, maybe in kind of how to use the leading, the kind of central philosophical discourse for talking about the mind, and kind of about the epistemic commitments of various facts about the mental. And eventually I reasoned myself into this kind of anti-realism. I happened to sort of trip over some stuff that was being done in dynamic semantics that was, it's kind of a somewhat mentalistic way of thinking about logic, but also carries a bunch of further kind of doctrinal commitments. But thinking about things over the years, I sort of figured out how to take a kind of very super conservative framework apparatus. So the stuff from David Kaplan, demonstratives like Robert Stalnaker, assertion, David Lewis, right? That kind of cluster of ways of dealing with like modality, pragmatics, and logical consequence, and just kind of take out the doctrine that logic is about truth preservation, replace it with the doctrine that logic is about preservation of endorsement. And then it's kind of like, okay, grind out things to say about these are those phenomena, grind out resolutions to these things that seem like problems, et cetera, et cetera. So follow where the theory leads me, I guess.
Yeah, and I just thought of another question about this preservation of endorsement thing. Do we, in figuring out what the sort of logical rules are or valid inferences on this view, do we start with looking at the things that people endorse and kind of the relations that obtain between them, or how would that how would that work?
Yeah, sure. Cool. I guess I conceive of the project as the enterprise as kind of a phenomenological enterprise. One way to maybe both motivate this and give like a little bit more of a sense of what I mean is that sort of logic should be explanatory bedrock, and kind of whatever we think of logic as being about should be the thing that's sort of responsible for all, accommodating all else, right? So the truth, kind of truth preservation conception of logic's, the kind of structure of logic is supplied by the actual world, which carries within its nature all of its alternatives, the possible worlds. And the way to kind of ultimately grok what the valid inferences are is to think about what the world requires by its nature or something like that. Okay, so analogously, if we think of logic as being about the preservation of endorsement, then what is it going to be that plays the role of the actual world? What is it going to be that, so that, the actual world doesn't, so possible worlds provide truth values, but they disagree with one another. So grass is green is true according to the actual world, but false according to some other possible worlds, right? So they don't provide truth values, at least not all of them provide truth values simpliciter, but they only provide truth values relative to themselves, right? But ultimately, there's this notion of truth. Truth simpliciter, not relative to anything, so truth kind of in the absolute sense. And what the job of the actual world is to provide truth in the absolute sense. Okay, so if we're looking for, the analog to the actual world, you want to find, if you're looking for something for the analog to the actual world, you want to find the thing that provides endorsement values. So endorse, reject, or be uncertain, not relative, not relatively, but absolutely. So what is that thing going to be? Well, the way that one should say it is the endorsement values simpliciter are provided by my present mental state. And I kind of mean something a little bit different by that than you do. But that's the underlying idea, right? And so it's like the thing that's sort of theoretical bedrock here and that accounts for everything else ultimately ends up being my present mental state. So what the rest of the mental states are like is kind of just as what the rest of the possible worlds are like is generated by the possibilities for the actual world. So kind of the limits and scope of its nature. Similarly, what the rest of the mental states are like, the intelligible mental states, they're provided by my present mental state, by its kind of structural scope and limits, and what, which deformations of it I can find myself capable of locating empathetically or otherwise. So kind of in that sense, if we're looking for what the range of mental states are like, the enterprise is one of figuring out what how a mental state could intelligibly be, and that's a kind of phenomenological enterprise, maybe in a broad sense. And let's see. Okay, where was I? So if we're looking for which inferences are going to be the valid inferences, we want to know, okay, what's the range of intelligible mental states? Those are the facts that kind of generate which valid inferences there are. But figuring out what the range of intelligible mental states is this phenomenological enterprise of figuring out what kind of thing my present mental state is and what deformations I can make of it while still entertaining things that are intelligibly similar. That kind of phenomenological enterprise of seeing what I can imagine is how I get to what the endorsement logical valid inferences are like. Long answer.
Yeah, no, that's good. So seeing what you can imagine. So is it, and I think maybe you have a more recent paper where you discuss something similar, but does this make logic and modality here relativized to each individual, or how would you think of that?
Interesting. Yeah, that's something that's been vexing me a little bit lately. So, I mean, I guess, if we think of the kind of broadest notion of modality as having a logic that's S5, then it's kind of like, what that means is that accessibility is an equivalence relation, so that from at least how things look from here, it's like I can go anywhere and come back and like go anywhere else and come back, and you know, these guys are accessible to me, and so are those guys. They're accessible to each other, and so kind of the scope and limits of the actual world are going to be the same as the scope and limits of any world that's it's available as the same as one of its kind, right? So that's the sort of S5ist type picture. And to the extent that we want to, there's this kind of radicalism within conservatism. So we got these conservative structures, but we make this radical foundational change, replacing truth with endorsement. Then, well, okay, so let's like hang on to this S5ism where like all the mental states are mutually intra-intelligible. And so kind of in that sense, then we also wind up with a kind of non-relativized conception of the broadest modality. So whatever is possible in the broadest sense, according to my present mental state, is also possible in the broadest sense according to anybody else's mental state.
So you would still endorse something like S5 for your system here? Because I could easily imagine like rejecting that and say what might be maybe you don't have transitivity, so it might be accessible to you, and in terms of someone else's mental states and what might be accessible to them, some of the things accessible to them might not be accessible to you. I mean, that seems a more.
These are deep and powerful questions, and I mean, I guess it's sort of the reason I'm thinking that it's S5 is safe choice. Conservative, it's sort of kind of in significant part what sort of guides the various choice points in constructing this enterprise is like, let's kind of keep it close to the rails, right? So not kind of say anything particularly controversial unless you need to, right? So it's like, okay, cool. So S5, that's a kind of pretty commonly accepted demand, the broadest notion of modality. So if I want a kind of analog notion, then it's like, okay, cool. So it's going to be an S5 notion. And then these questions arise. What does that amount to, right? So what is it for the broadest notion of modality to have an S5 structure where it's over this kind of space of mental states as opposed to over worlds, right? So that question, that's sort of the kind of first question to be answered. Then it's like, okay, cool. So once we have a good understanding of that, then it's like, what would it be to start monkeying around, say it's not S5, but it's subject to weaker restrictions, and what happened, what's predicted in those cases, and so do we like what comes out of that more than what we saw when we did the conservative thing? I mean, it's sort of like research program. These are great questions, and I just don't know right now.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, there's definitely a lot to explore there, and maybe try to flesh out some of the different possible kind of package deals you can have of this sort of view.
Definitely.
Is that the sort of thing that you're working on or plan to pursue more? Or
yeah, down the line. So like right now, I'm kind of I've got this book manuscript in. Right. And so it's over being read, and so that book manuscript is kind of about what does this endorsement logic look like in kind of relatively elementary terms, and then how do we link up endorsement logic with kind of central aspects of mental discourse, and then how do we resolve some kind of challenges in the philosophy of mind, stuff about rationality, about metaphysics, about epistemology, describing the kind of expressivist system that emerges, saying some of these things about kind of you're forever stuck in a quandary, kind of attacking the notion of phenomenal character, like kind of expanding on this idea that there's no metaphysics of the mental, and so kind of in consequence, I end up talking about zombies for quite a while. But yeah, so that's what goes on there. Once that's kind of in the can, then it's sort of on to talk in some more depth about some epistemological stuff, and probably in the fullness of time, I'll start thinking in terms of what different, the sort of consequences for philosophy of mind of different modal systems inside of endorsement logic, but that's not going to happen immediately, I'm afraid.
No, yeah, that's very cool. It's nice to see that you got something in the works on that. I did want to ask another question, and or maybe a question or two, and then we can wrap up. I don't want to keep you all day, but
I'm enjoying it.
yeah, it's great. And I mean, you've talked a little bit about the metaphysics and like metaphysically possible. Metaphysical modality is a term that gets tossed around a lot in current analytic philosophy. But for me, the notion seems a bit murky. It's not really clear what's being said sometimes when someone says that something's metaphysically possible. Do you think that there are like laws of metaphysics that might serve as a basis of that modality, or is it some like primitive notion? Or, I mean, what do you think about metaphysical modality in general?
Interesting. Yeah, all right. So I have you may have talked with Jessica Wilson. I guess you did talk with Jessica Wilson a few months ago, and you may have chatted with her about this relativized metaphysical modality research program. So Jess and I have a former student, Professor Adam Murray at University of Manitoba, and we've been working out this project that Jess and Adam published on initially in 2012. And kind of in a nutshell, the thought there is that a lot of work was done on trying to balance out the desire for an S5 conception of modality with various phenomena that seem to militate against it. And so some folks were thinking, hey, we got to go to S4 instead and live with whatever that requires of us. Or other folks were thinking, oh, hey, we have to weaken the phenomena because we got to stick by S5 or something like that. Jess and Adam, I guess, noticed that, in fact, like this, all this work sort of got rolling sort of prior to the introduction of the kind of two-dimensional way of thinking about modality, where when I say that so-and-so is true at a possible world, I'm kind of not done yet. I need to say it's true from the point of view of a certain possible world at a certain potentially different possible world. And so that gets you this kind of idea that there's this, this sort of pragmatical idea that there's this context within which we speak, and that affects the meanings of our, of our sentences. And, then having fixed the meaning of a sentence, well, that in turn determines a set of possible worlds as its truth condition, right? And so, yeah, so the sort of first possible world, that's the one that has this pragmatic role of establishing what we meant. But then the second possible world, that's sort of something that's like, okay, cool. Is that in the truth condition or not that's been fixed by the context? Okay. So it turns out that this notion, this way of, this sort of two-dimensional way of thinking about modality allows you to lift this tension arising from cases of variation in the putative variation in the facts about metaphysical modality, such that you can stick with S5 and stick with the phenomena. And the thought there is that that from the point of view of metaphysics, what is metaphysically possible, and I'll get back to kind of how this bears on the interpretation of that, is not kind of ground, it's not kind of ground, it's not bedrock. Instead, it's explained in terms of two other factors. So there's which world is actual. So there's the kind of categorical nature of the world. And then there's a sort of set of kind of conditionals that take you from categorical descriptions of the actual world to statements about what's metaphysically possible. And so, hey, having fixed an actual world, then this system of laws of modality, if you will, get us to what the actual facts about what's metaphysically necessary, what's metaphysically possible are. So circling back to this question of how this bears on the way that we should think about the notion of metaphysical modality, metaphysical necessity, we think of, so there's sort of a couple different ways of think about that. So there's this notion of the broadest form of necessity, the kind of thing that's just those necessities that are the hardest to find, those possibilities are the easiest to find. It's the broadest form of modality. But then there's also this notion that, hey, what modality is provided by is the space of possible worlds. The space of possible worlds are the space of alternatives to the actual world. So, and that space is kind of generated by the nature or structure of the actual world and which deformations it kind of could be subject to. And so if you think about things in those terms, then yeah, sure, there's going to be this ineliminable appeal to the actual world as providing the structure that's responsible for modality, right? So the thought is that, well, it's not just kind of sort of ineluctable absolute structure, but puzzles of modal variation also show that there's sort of just brutally contingent facts about what the actual world is like that get involved in determining what the space of candidate alternatives to it are.
I mean, I like in general, I'm thinking about, thinking about the variations that the actual world could exhibit as, determining what the space of possible worlds is like. But maybe a slight issue there is that when you say the ways it can vary, I mean, that's still a modal notion, right? Or does it make it kind of circular here, or how do we understand that?
Yes, I mean, yeah. So I think like it's maybe not a circularity, but a local holism. So we got this question like, what is the structure of the actual world, right? Okay, well, what do you mean by that? It's like, well, okay, so which subject, which intelligible deformations is the actual world subject to? It's like, okay, cool. I'm sort of starting to fill out the picture. It's like, what do you mean deforming the actual world though? It's like, well, it's sort of how can the actual world be in a way that's consistent with its fundamental kind and nature or something like that, right? So it's sort of by, we sort of talk our way back into modality, putting it this way, yeah. But we sort of, in so doing, we're not attempting to introduce these concepts from ground zero, but like rather just sort of indicate how they all relate to one another.
So maybe the notions are already there. We're just seeing how these things relate to each other.
Yeah, that's right. Sort of like that. To kind of contrast David Lewis on modality with maybe Williamson on knowledge. So Lewis is like, hey, modality, that's messed up. We got to reduce it. And he reduces it to this big old weird ontology and quantification. By contrast, Williamson says, hey, everybody was trying to reduce away knowledge all these years, but Gettyerology failed. So it's a primitive concept. That does not mean that epistemology has to be boring. Rather, what we want to do is map out the interrelations between the concept of knowledge, or the concept of phenomenon of knowledge, and other associated phenomena. So knowledge, it turns out, has kind of epistemological significance, but knowledge is evidence, thesis, and significance of philosophy of language by the knowledge norm assertion, and blah blah blah. So I sort of see this kind of conceptual map making or description of models of the articulation of the interesting phenomena or something is the kind of most productive philosophical enterprise, and not so much kind of like giving explicit definitions or trying to reduce things away.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I've been a little bit I've been a bit sympathetic to the view that like Ted Sider has talked about the sort of conventionalist, quasi-conventionalist view that we just have different systems, maybe some more or less formal than others, and we can use those to define sort of what is possible or not possible in different respects. That's not something you would find plausible or at least in broad strokes.
I mean, I do metaphysics on the side. I consider, sort of my heart is in the stuff about philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, epistemology, philosophy of logic, like this kind of budget of issues. And kind of, one reason that I wanted to, one of the things that attracts me to this kind of logical mentalist endorsement preservation way of doing things is that it makes it so that this cluster of issues can be discussed kind of independently of metaphysical reasoning. And, sort of when there are questions in metaphysics that touch on or interestingly contacted by these questions in philosophy of language, philosophy of logic that I'm sort of conversant with, then I feel, okay, kind of going over there and poaching on their preserves. But sort of being a metaphysician has sort of never really been my driving aim in philosophy.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I think to wrap up, I'm gonna finish with a sort of metaphilosophical question that I like to ask a lot of the guests on here. What do you think is the value of philosophy in general? I mean, maybe to you specifically, but also to society. What is philosophy good for, do you think?
So the benefit to society, I think, is maybe what I'll have to say about that is kind of anodyne. I mean, so one thing that philosophy does for us is kind of provide a model of dispassionate disagreement and exquisitely careful construction of texts and engagement, textually based intellectual engagement. And I think that kind of one of the things that I tell my kids in my intro to epistemology class is, how things work. It's like you've been over to comment threads. People just like start like trolling each other almost immediately. What we do in philosophy is we stand for a way of thinking about reasoning and disputation that kind of allows you to not have to do that frustrating, horrible thing. Sort of like allows you to not let your passions lead you into acting like a jerk anytime somebody disagrees with you. But instead, you can sort of say, okay, cool, like let's step back, lay out in detail what the issues are and see if we can collectively make headway, right? And so kind of teaching wise, I see kind of presenting people with the idea that you can confront disputation, confusion, and really murky issues in ways that don't make people have to pick sides and then freak out. That's sort of one of the things that I think is kind of our highest value pedagogically. In terms of production of theories, like I had this image that I developed when I was on a big Dr. House watching kick, like back in the late 00s, the neonatal intensive care unit of theory. So it's sort of like, hey, there are all these theories out there that nobody's been paying any attention to, and most of them are going to die, but maybe some of them will live, right? And so it's, well, how do you know, right? Well, you have to treat them with exquisite care and develop them. And maybe some of them will, most of them they're just going to not make it, but a lot of them are going to get, some of them are going to get fledged out into society, and then you get things like, for better or for worse, the computer. And so that's sort of research-wise. I guess another thing is, I think that one thing philosophy can do, but does not, because the kind of analytic tradition was set up to stop it from doing that, is to demarcate the distinction between the human sciences and the natural sciences. So I got this book where I'm arguing that mental discourse is fundamentally different from discourse about the mental is fundamentally different from discourse about the physical. This kind of goes back to this 19th century way of thinking about things that gave us the structure of the university, where it's like there's the human sciences, and those go by interpretation and empathy. The natural sciences, and those go by observation, objectivity, and experimentation. Analytic philosophy, like Neurath, Carnap, they didn't like that idea. They thought that, we should just they wanted to take the human sciences and remake them in the model of the natural sciences. I think that's a mistake. And the kind of symptom of this is that the analytic philosophy of mind is in a state of kind of constant chasing its own tail. And sort of what I'm trying to do, one of the kind of major enterprises of this book is trying to develop in ways that are up to the standards that of theory construction that Neurath and Carnap gifted us with, amazingly, but that bring back to life these ideas that the kind of late 19th century neo-Kantians from the hermeneutic tradition had developed. What does philosophy give me? What got me into philosophy was this charge that I got from my first meeting of this class, Mind, Matter, and Meaning at Stanford when I was a freshman, taught by Ed Zalta. So Ed was talking about here's the problem of free will. Four premises, each one of them plausible, gets you to a contradiction. And I was like, oh my God, the problem of free will is something that always seemed so incredibly nebulous. Look at this, you could take this like nebulous, crazy protean shape of confusion and state exactly what it is, and like give this kind of mathematical crystalline structure to the whole enterprise. And I was like, this is so exciting. I want to do this for a living, basically. And that's still how I look at it. I just, love doing the work of philosophy. Like I love kind of finding the mathematics and the mush in a way.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I definitely like a lot of the way you put that.
Thank you.
Your answer, it's a good answer. So yeah, I think we'll end the questions there, and thanks so much for being here. It's been really great having you and hearing your answers to my questions. It's been excellent.
Thanks so much for having us on, Troy. It was a real pleasure. You're like, Jess told me that you were a fantastic interviewer. It was really true. Really good.